In this first lesson on the philosophy of religion, what we're going to do is outline a number of key important issues that we're going to be discussing more and more throughout this series of lessons before we outline the main arguments for the existence of God that we're going to be analysing. So this whole series of lessons should really be divided into two major aspects. So you've got the traditional arguments for the existence of God, which we'll discuss later on in this lesson. And then we've got a number of extra areas of the philosophy of religion that we're also going to look at. Things like the problem of evil, things like the concept of religious experience, religious language, etc., etc. Now, these also relate to arguments for the existence of God. However, they don't necessarily fit within the exact same regime as the traditional arguments, which is what we will begin with. So specifically in this lesson, we're going to look at introducing the traditional arguments for the existence of God. We're going to examine the nature of these traditional arguments, generally examine the nature of argumentation in general, have a look at the difference between different kinds of arguments that we can formulate, and then outline the arguments that we are going to proceed with going forward. So the traditional arguments for the existence of God ask the question whether or not it is possible for people to demonstrate God's existence through argumentation. Can we prove that God exists by using philosophical arguments, by using logic and reasoning and different things like that? Now, it should be noted that a number of the traditional arguments for the existence of God did not originate out of a desire to try and prove God's existence to non-believers or atheists. They came out of a desire to almost solidify people's own beliefs in God himself. So really there's been a long philosophical tradition of trying to demonstrate God's existence through various arguments. Arguably an incredibly long tradition, stretching back thousands of years. One issue of proving God's existence is that God is unable to be experienced through the senses, or at least, some might disagree with that, because we're going to look at what are known as the things like the teleological argument, for example, sort of tangentially relates to one's experience with the world. However, generally speaking, God doesn't reveal himself in a way that that may or may not be sufficient for proving his or her existence. So this means that effectively God cannot be seen, heard, or felt through perception. So it makes it very difficult for us to try and prove the existence of something that we cannot perceptually interact with. Paul Tillich argues that really questions like does God exist, they're not really even questions that we should be effectively discussing. So Tillich took a theological position in this argument. He stated that to argue for the existence of something, it implies that the thing you're arguing for something to have existence has been created. Now, since according to Tillich God is infinite, he suggests that it's meaningless and it is misleading to suggest that we should be arguing for the, quote, existence of God, because for something to exist, it requires it to have been created. Now, there is a little bit of, back and forth you can go there with Paul Tillich. Me personally, I don't necessarily agree with Paul Tillich on this argument here. I don't think that he fundamentally, sufficiently, in my mind, argues that existence requires creation, or that existence implies creation. That's not sufficiently proven or shown in my opinion. But however, in Tillich's opinion, arguments for the existence of God are fundamentally flawed for this very reason. So what kind of arguments can we really pick out? And this really brings us on to the concept of argumentation in general. Now, we have a series of lessons on argumentation already, looking at types of arguments within philosophy and how to form valid and sound arguments. We're actually going to be applying some of those principles here. You don't necessarily need to have watched those previous lessons to be able to follow along with the philosophy of religion, because generally it's quite intuitive how we teach it. However, if you feel like you want to, you can if you want. So let's have a look at the distinction between inductive and deductive arguments, inductive and deductive reasoning. So the vast majority of philosophical arguments are based either inductively or deductively. Inductive reasoning is when people make inferences and draw general conclusions from particular examples. Okay? So, depending on the evidence and the data available, inductive arguments may be strong or weak. So you can make an inductive argument using the evidence of things, empirical data from around you, and depending on how much data you have, we could argue, and how reliable that data is, you could argue how strong or weak the argument may be. So let's have a look at the following example of a weak inductive argument. So, premise 1, there are 2 robberies in my neighbourhood last month. There were 2 robberies in my neighbourhood last month. That's the first premise. That's the proposition, which can either have a true or false value, a truth value ascribed to it. Premise 2, both were committed by teenagers. Therefore, all crime is committed by teenagers. Now, what have we got here? We've got what we would describe as an inductive argument. It is an argument based on evidence, the evidence of robberies going on in my neighbourhood last month. Okay, we would say that it is a weak argument because it's very restrictive in the amount of evidence that we are using to make this, to come to this conclusion. So we are saying that because there were 2 robberies in my neighbourhood last month and they were both committed by teenagers, therefore all crime has to be committed by teenagers. Now we can prove that this is false by providing a counter-argument to it, which would simply be, here's a crime over here that was committed by an adult. So, really, you can argue against this argument all day long. On the other hand, on the other side of the coin, we have deductive arguments, and these are based on reasoning and logic, a lot more reasoning and logic. So, in a deductive argument, it is the case that if the premises of the argument are true, okay, then the conclusion has to be true. It must be true. It would be impossible for the conclusions to be true and for the premises to be true and for the conclusion to be false. That is a deductive argument. Let's look at this following example. Premise 1, all men are mortal. Premise 2, Socrates is a man. Therefore, conclusion, Socrates is mortal. Now, this is a deductive argument, okay? It is also known as a syllogism, the specific type of argument that we're looking at here. And the way it works is we have a broad premise, a broad proposition that makes the claim that all men are mortal, which is true. It happens to be true, okay? And then we are looking at a more specific premise, which is that Socrates is a man. And so therefore, if all men are mortals and Socrates is a man, it would be impossible for us not to conclude that Socrates is also mortal. Because if he wasn't mortal, then he's either not a man or all men aren't mortal. So if this conclusion is false, then either premise 2 is false or premise 1 is false. They can't all be true. They can't both be true and this be false. Therefore, it is a deductive, valid deductive argument. It's also a sound argument, because a sound argument refers to whether or not the premises are true or false. Okay. So, for example, I could have an argument here exactly the same as this, but instead of saying all men are mortal, I could write all men are immortal, and also conclude that Socrates is therefore immortal if Socrates is a man. This would still be a valid argument, because the premises still logically entail the conclusion. However, it wouldn't be a sound argument because the premises are false, because all men aren't immortal. In fact, we're yet to find a single man that is immortal. So therefore, we can make logical deductions of this sort. If you want to go into a little bit more detail on this, we have, like I said, a whole series of lessons on the different ways in which philosophers create and construct arguments. Let's have a look before we go at the concept of a priori versus a posteriori arguments. So this is a different way in which we can distinguish between types of arguments. An a priori argument is one which relies on a process of logic to prove a point. Okay, and by contrast, again, by just another side of the coin, an a posteriori argument is one that depends on some kind of evidence or empirical evidence to support it. And so we'll be referring back to these terms throughout the next series of lessons on the traditional arguments for the existence of God. Which brings us neatly to the end of this lesson, which is looking at what these arguments are. What are the traditional arguments for the existence of God? Well, we're going to explore a few variations of them, and we're going to start by looking at the ontological argument, specifically ontological arguments, originating with Anselm, and we're going to go through and have a look at other examples, people like Descartes, for example. And then we're going to look at cosmological arguments, then we're going to look at teleological arguments, and then we're going to finish off by looking at moral arguments. Now, these I call the traditional arguments for the existence of God, but you could also throw in the problem of evil, you could also throw in religious experience, revelation, all these different things which we're also going to look at, but I didn't really class them as the traditional arguments for the existence of God. So in the next lesson, we're going to begin by looking at arguably one of the oldest arguments for the existence of God, which is the ontological argument.